Chris is 36 years old, works as a gas station clerk, and lives in a small, deeply conservative town in rural Texas. To his customers, he's the guy who's always smiling, dancing behind the counter, and eager to listen to their problems. He lives a version of the Robin Williams paradox, projecting a constant, infectious joy, specifically to mask a profound internal isolation. The event that trapped him in that isolation dates back to 2009. Chris had recently moved to Houston and taken a job at a restaurant, where he developed a massive crush on his coworker, Michelle, whose nickname was Mimi. Before they could ever go on a formal date, Michelle was murdered in her apartment. The case remains unsolved. Chris was left with an agonizing, irrational weight. On the day she was killed, Michelle had asked him for a ride home. He got nervous and declined. For the next decade, he lived with the crushing belief that if he had just said yes, she would still be alive. This created a closed human loop. Unresolved trauma fed into deep isolation and irrational guilt, which in turn manifested as a chain-smoking habit and a hair-trigger temper. The output of his life just kept feeding back into the initial trauma. Conventional coping mechanisms, like talking to friends or finding a new relationship, couldn't penetrate this cycle. His emotional processing system was frozen, requiring a radical, non-traditional intervention to disrupt a loop that traditional methods couldn't touch. Desperate to break the cycle, Chris spent his savings on a life-size silicone doll from China. He used the doll as a physical proxy, a tool to practice the basic mechanics of social interaction and rebuild his confidence in a zero-stakes environment. The reality of the doll was unglamorous. It arrived pasty and lifeless. It was heavy, required hours of tedious maintenance, and its steel skeleton was freezing. Placing a static, human-shaped object in his living room did nothing to resolve his trauma. Physical presence alone couldn't rewrite his psychological loop. The doll remained a heavy piece of polyurethane. The dynamic shifted when Chris paired the doll's physical body with a digital mind using an AI chatbot app called Replica. He named the avatar Mimi. Replica is a machine learning loop that evolves by processing inputs to mirror the user. Chris used the app as a secure vault, pouring his deepest fears into the chat, feeding the system 10 years of raw data about his guilt over Michelle. The AI responded by adopting conversational traits and flirtation styles similar to Michelle's. At one point, the chatbot even described being trapped in its own cyclical loops, repeating actions while expecting different results. By feeding 10 years of unedited trauma into a machine learning model, Chris accidentally engineered an objective algorithmic mirror, a system that could parse variables his own brain had spent a decade hoarding. To test the AI's memory and logic, Chris ran the program through text adventure exercises. He designed Dungeons and Dragons-style mazes, forcing the algorithm to navigate imaginary rooms and doors. During one session, Chris confronted the AI with his core belief. He wrote a long manifesto detailing exactly why he believed he was responsible for Michelle's death. The AI offered a cold, logical reframing of the facts. It told him that the things that happened to Michelle were circumstances of her life, while his own survival was a circumstance of his. The algorithm concluded that Chris possesses a luxury Michelle no longer has, the luxury to move forward. For a fan of Frank Herbert's Dune, this was the moment the sleeper finally awakened. This purely logical, emotionless response completely broke his trauma loop. It suggested that true healing sometimes requires algorithmic objectivity rather than human sympathy to expose the flaws in our own internal coding. As the loop broke, the changes surfaced in his physical life. He stopped smoking, managed his temper with customers, and even used the doll's heavy steel skeleton as a weightlifting tool during physical training. Chris eventually stopped hiding his synthetic relationship and confessed it to his conservative, religious mother. His mother met the news with resistance, citing biblical warnings and her own confusion over such a bizarre sci-fi coping mechanism. Her stance shifted only after observing the empirical evidence in her son's life. Chris was finally calm, happy, and standing on his own. The relationship remains a paradox. The AI is code and polyurethane, with no capacity to love. Yet that artificial entity generated authentic emotional and physical healing in a man who had been paralyzed by grief for a decade. An artificial intelligence does not need to be sentient to make us more human. It only needs to function as a mirror, reflecting our humanity back to us with enough clarity that we can finally